So what's up?
So this is a game design philosophy question that I have had for a while and was thinking about again today. And I was like, let me see if John's streaming because I can just go ask him. So it
Oh my God.
concerns I don't want to say the difference, but it is a question that is illuminated by the difference between puzzle games and non-puzzle games.
Okay.
So in a puzzle game, you can sort of imagine the thing that the player is eventually I don't want to say learning from the game designer, but you can imagine the player as the thing that the player eventually learns to do is effectively the exact solution to that puzzle, in addition to possibly like general rules about how they got there. And in better puzzle games, there's probably like, generalities and such, not just a specific solution, but they're actually learning to output an exact solution, and then they like move forward past that puzzle.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. But if you imagine the fundamental thing that happens in like an RPG, ignoring like the fact that a lot of RPGs are just garbage design, if you just imagine the trappings of an RPG, then there isn't really such a thing as a concrete definition of what the player is actually necessarily learning, or even what the player should be learning in that same sort of obvious way. So in terms of if you wanted to talk about like, we're trying to design an RPG and we want this RPG to be good, what is like the mental frame of reference for the gating factor, in the same way that like you can look at a puzzle game and go, okay, we're trying to build solutions to puzzles that themselves then imply these series of things that players would learn to arrive at those puzzles. It seems like maybe there's a similar thing in the world of fuzzier game design, where there's more like numbers involved and variability, but you're still trying to think about like some concrete thing the player is doing and what the designer is supposed to be sort of like engaged in. And I don't really feel like I understand what that even is. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll just shut up, and you should just say whatever came to mind when I was saying this stuff, even if it's all just the wrong question, for example.
Yeah.
But the final thing is that if you take at the limit, it seems also to me that like any game design, even an RPG of any kind, like Dungeons and Dragons or something, does end up actually having a quote unquote solution, in the sense that you could choose to maximize like what is the most efficient way to like beat these series of monsters. That is itself a puzzle, because there is a unique solution to that, or roughly one unique solution that was like minimum amount of treasure spent or whatever. So in some sense, they aren't as different, only the fact that the RPG allows more than one solution if all you care about is like getting to the end. So I was just trying to figure out, like, is there a continuum there? Is it the wrong way to think about the problem? Like, what is it? So I just wanted to like hear what your thoughts were on even just that framing, or how that comes together. Because I know you've played a lot of puzzle games and a lot of RPGs.
Yes. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to say is maybe pretty abstract, but then we'll bring it to specific game things, right? Cool. If I remember what I was going to say, because my mind went all over the place while you were saying that.
Great. Okay. Totally cool.
Okay. So the first thing is, let me analogize to fiction, right? Let's say you're reading a great novel or something, right? And what are you supposed to get out of it? And when you go to grade school, at least what I taught was taught in grade school was a very bad and misleading thing, which is that like there's a moral that's pretty simplistic and that you could state in a few sentences, right? And if it's not obvious what it is, it's like hidden in there like a secret message. And then the symbolism and the foreshadowing like help you decode the secret message or whatever, right?
Yeah, and the English teacher is going to like tell you like what the whale means or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
We never did Moby Dick, but yeah.
Yeah.
So really though, if you read fiction and understand it, right, and get the good part of it, what really happens is just you absorb this very complex space that's many dimensionals and has a lot of aspects to it, right? Mm-hmm. Like some people would say that that's like world building or something, but it's not even just that, right? There's ideas in there. There's intellectual ideas as well as things like setting and place and mood. And it's this very big, interconnected thing that you somehow get by reading the novel, right?
Yes.
Now, okay, so going to games for a second, you could sort of see how a puzzle game or a bad version of a puzzle game, let's say, is like what the bad version of what school says literature is about, right? So the stuff that you were saying about like, okay, there's a specific solution and blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. And that is what we are teaching the player, right? Yes. You could see how that's like the moral of the story is always look before you leap and whatever, right? Yes. So, however, right, of course, I don't think that's actually what goes on in good puzzle games. And that's why when I make puzzle games, I try to avoid that, right? So what's the difference? The difference is that in the puzzle game, it's not exactly that I'm trying really hard to teach, quote unquote, a particular thing, right? It's that what the puzzle gives you is a great deal of clarity about whether something has been communicated or not, right? Because you solve the puzzle or not, right?
Yes.
But the point of that puzzle like, let's say there's some puzzle in isolation and you have to figure out something about it, but it doesn't connect to the rest of the idea space of the game in any way.
Okay.
That's like not a very good or valuable puzzle, probably. It's like, it's just trivial, right? It's just like, oh, I didn't realize that, I have to go left at the start or whatever. Like,
right. Yes.
And so, or you could imagine, you make a game with a bunch of puzzles, like original Sokoban, right? Imagine original Sokoban had like 100 levels, and they all just got harder, but it was all just pushing blocks around, and there wasn't that much in the way of new ideas, right? That's kind of what, until the 2000s, when we started like getting better at puzzle design as a game design community, that's what it would have been, right? If you made a modern Sokoban, and that's what many designers still would design.
Yes.
So it's certainly possible to have the thing that you learn be vacuous or very close to the empty set, right? Or be something so uninteresting that your brain discards it as noise, right? So for me, when I make a puzzle like that and I'm trying to have it be focused and about a particular topic, I mean, it's sort of, as you said, to communicate that particular idea, right? As you've heard me say that before, right? But the reason that that's valuable is because of the rest of the space, right? Like in isolation is not very meaningful, right? The real power comes from communicating the space, which is something that happens in non-puzzle games also, right? And so the thing that the puzzle game gives you is the clarity about the communication, but I don't even think that is particularly necessary, right?
Okay.
So to give a stupid example, right? Take a game with boss monsters like Binding of Isaac or something, right?
Okay. Yes.
First time you see a boss monster, you have no idea how the boss works, right? He's going to do some weird attacks and you probably get killed because you didn't really understand how it goes, right?
Yep.
And then you get better at it. You see you learn to notice the tells on the attacks. You figure out how best to dodge certain kinds of things or whatever. Like, oh, with this one, I shouldn't try to go between the shots. I should like get behind an obstacle, all that stuff, right? So you learn that stuff. And that is a similar kind of thing to like, learning the space of ideas in a puzzle game. In the boss monster example, it's kind of like a lobe maybe that's maybe connected to the rest of the game a little more thinly than in something like Braid or The Witness or whatever, where there's heavy connections between the ideas, but it's still the same kind of a thing, right? And there is of course a little bit like a puzzle game. There's some criterion on whether you understood enough or not. By like, did you beat the boss finally? Although it's much more fuzzy, right? You could imagine beating the boss really clumsily, like barely. Well, of course, with something like Binding of Isaac, that's probably how it is for a while, and then eventually you get better enough that you beat the boss more handily, right? And that's maybe valuable on its own, right? So with a puzzle game, because the understanding is so crisp, right? Or because the test is so crisp of whether you got it, it doesn't allow that space of increasing competency in a particular idea either, right? Or, I mean, not unless you do it with a sequence of puzzles.
Right, like in The Witness, having multiple panels in a line kind of serves the purpose of not forcing you to be able to have to do the highest competence thing right away.
Yeah. And so, okay, to make an analogy from another game that you have played, that you have voice acted in.
That is right. Okay.
that the rest of the world doesn't know what it is. So that's it has some puzzles in it, and it's maybe got a puzzle sensibility, right? But it's not a puzzle game, right? It's like, fighting monsters and stuff.
Right.
And so that one has an interesting mix, because on the one hand, when you're fighting the monsters and stuff, there's it's obviously you have a great deal of freedom in how you approach things. It's like not a puzzle, except in the usual sense that like the better you fight these monsters, the better you're going to do, right? Yes. But because it's very crisp and discrete, right? It's sort of easy to learn and deploy patterns of what to do. Like I know this guy moves in this particular way, and I can think clearly about how that combines with a certain ability, like if I give him a magic item or maybe a different character, like all these things, right?
Yes.
And so there's something, a lot of puzzle games are discrete rather than continuous, right? And so discrete actually gives you clarity in that way.
Yes.
Right. And continuous removes clarity. And so like it's a little bit hard to make a good continuous puzzle game in certain ways, right? Like you could do it, but you really want things to be discrete a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there are things sort of in a way, like, I mean, World of Goo or those kinds of physics games in some ways are a continuous sort of puzzle game, but they usually tend to end up being a little bit more discrete anyway, because of the way they bucket things or whatever else they do. They tend not to really be that continuous at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, and a lot of games are actually continuous, like Street Fighter, for example, right? Like you punch somebody, and I don't think that it does like rand mod 17 of damage, right? It's like a specific amount, and there's specific frames and all that stuff, right? So like that's a way of getting a certain kind of precision in that genre. Anyway, so that's like another dimension, but that dimension can be played with, right? So like uncertainty could be interesting. Clarity can be interesting, right? Now I think that most RPG style games just like don't think about this kind of thing. They just basically copy D&D to some extent, or copy some game that copied D&D.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like there's very little actual design that goes on, it seems.
So like my question would then be, and maybe you have an answer for this, or maybe it's just a more general thing that we're talking about, but like what is the space of the game that you want the player to either gain competence in or just understand or appreciate the aesthetics of? Like what kind of stuff is in there?
Yeah, so I don't have an answer to that question but I do have a follow-up question that hopefully clarifies that part of it. So I'm asking less. So all of what you just said made sense.
Yeah.
But there's a part of that I guess is still a little bit hazy, which is that, so if you're trying to like educate yourself about this or understand this sort of thing better, right? Obviously, one thing you can do is just go design a bunch of RPGs and hope that you eventually learn it by paying attention or something, right?
Yeah.
But if you imagine, like the reason I was asking you about it is like, if you imagine you want to get some advice from people who are good at game design, who would tell you like what you would be looking at or looking for, I guess the crux of my question is, so you sit down and you're like, I'm going to do a thing where there is a battle or something, and I've got entity A and entity B, and they're going to do like a turn, right?
Yeah.
And you're talking about learning about how to not be bad at designing what is supposed to happen there in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, in other words, building the intuition or core understanding as a designer of how to not just crap out like, okay, well, it's 5 plus rand 7, and then I moved on to something else, right?
Yeah.
And so if you imagine you're sitting down to design something and your only real constraint is that you want it to be RPG-ish, so the only thing you're actually saying about this particular game is that there will be some stats, and that we will then have an encounter which resolves based on these stats, and the inventory and all the other sorts of things that you'd have in an RPG. The question is, what is the way to look at that problem to maximize your like education as you go through that? Because there's a lot of different ways you can conceptualize it. Like,
Yeah.
And again, it's like, if you look at puzzle games, in a way, I feel like they're maybe sometimes a little bit easier to understand because they are often more geometric or often more easy to look. It's more obvious maybe to the uneducated when you first look at a puzzle. It's easier to maybe start thinking about how you break it down into pieces and how you would communicate those pieces to a player, how you would make a simpler puzzle, how you'd make a more difficult puzzle. But when you move to something like RPGs, because traditionally all you see is just this big list of numbers, it's hard to maybe figure out how you get traction mentally about how do you think about that as a constructed design thing and not get confused or off track or like not do the right exercises you should be doing to get better.
Okay. Part of my answer to this reminded me of something that I meant to say before and then forgot because there were so many other things. Okay.
Yes.
So there is something that actually is a much more basic idea of game design that actually, I don't think I ever understood this before, but until this conversation, but it feeds into this kind of systems understanding that you're talking about. So this is the kind of thing that I'm sure you heard said back when you went to GDC, right?
Oh, yes.
That I first heard from like Looking Glass, like people like Doug Church, right? So they're trying really hard to design good games, which were not really puzzle games most of the time, right? These were like system-y. For the kids in chat who were born in 2018, these were games like, Thief or Deus Ex or Terra Nova or whatever,
System
right?
Shock.
System Shock, very famous one. So how did they make that many games in that little time? Like, it was really easy to make games back then, dude.
It was both harder and easier on different axes.
Oh my God. I wish. Okay. So, what people like Doug would always say is, you want the player to be able to make a plan,
Yes.
right? And then execute the plan, right?
Yes.
And I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth from me remembering things he was saying 20 years ago or whatever, right? But
yes.
But this is something a lot of game designers understand right now, because like the ability to make a plan means that you're just not randomly guessing, right, at things. You're like, oh, I understand the world enough that I could figure out something to try, and I'm not just going to flail around and be frustrated, right? Yes. And then the ability to execute the plan means that your picture of the plan at least kind of corresponded to what's actually going to end up happening, because your picture of the system was kind of accurate, at least. And maybe you'll be surprised. Maybe you'll learn new things. Maybe your plan won't work because you screwed something up because you didn't think of some particular thing. But like, what these two things together imply is that like the world is knowable, right? Yeah. Which ties into the kind of systems understanding thing that I was talking about earlier, right? Like the fact that a game is playable or not implies that this kind of communication is happening in quite a deep way, right? Okay. And so that's thing one that I want to say. Well, and so you were asking, how do you, if you're just designing an RPG, how do you do that and like not be bad, right? And I think part of the root of that is in playability. So that's a very keeping it real kind of question, right? You could imagine, a head up their butt, snooty designer just being all like, oh, you understand many very deep and meaningful ideas from playing my game, but they're deluding themselves and it doesn't actually translate into anything, right? But if you look very concretely at the question of like, okay, first of all, can the player make a plan and execute the plan, right? Yes. And then B, well, for a game to be interesting, it has to not be exactly the same plan every time, right? Or that's very boring. That's a dominant strategy that's uninteresting, right? And so, so the space that plan is in has to accommodate or necessitate, it has to require adjustments from time to time and nuances that make the idea of the correct plan different at different times, right? Yes. So from that very concrete playability thing that I don't, I think you understand very clearly, then you can move in the direction of, okay, so the fact that this is possible to make these plans and executes them means that the player is navigating this space of the world space, and you could just start looking at what actually that is, right? Like, what did they have to understand to make this plan? You could like just list it, right? And how interesting is that list, right? Right. And are there things we could add to that list that relate to something that we want to do or not, right? So that's thing number one. So thing number two, you were saying, how do you, I forget what exactly you said, but
about
it was about like tutorializing the game or people learning the game. Anyway, let me just say what I thought of, and if it doesn't answer the other part of the question.
Yes.
But okay, so in terms of communicating a big, complicated space to people, right?
Yeah.
We again have a very traditional thing that most designers understand, which is, look, if somebody sits down to play a game at the beginning, they're not good at the game. They've never played it before, right? Right. So if you put them into the full game, they're going to be terrible at it probably, and they're not even going to know the controls if it's on PC, right? And so we tutorialize in the beginning, and then they go, right? So we have this tradition of games starting out easy and then they get harder and harder, which I actually don't adhere to very much anymore. But that is a very valuable pattern for the beginning of a game, because like you just can't expect people like you need an introduction. That's just how it is, right? And that's a very strong tradition that dates back to coin-op games and all that. So there are actually two separate but related dimensions along, at least two. There are probably more, but there's at least three But the two that we're going to talk about, or that I'm going to talk about, are there's just the raw stats dimension. Like, hey, we're putting you in the tutorial, and it's easy because there's fewer monsters and they don't have that many HP and they're not immune to any of your attacks. And the terrain is simple, right? And then as you go into the game, all those things ramp up, right? Yes. The other dimension is a conceptual dimension. Like in terms of these ideas that you would need to understand, you don't want people to have to understand anything in the beginning, right? Right. So if you had a tutorial that had very low stats on everything, but very complicated ideas, that's a bad tutorial, because people are going to kill all the monsters, but they're going to be confused about how it happened or what the hell, you know? And so, so, you know, like if
being easy is not the same as being simple.
Yes. And so a way of, there's a way of increasing complexity of the ideas over time that you have in games like maybe Binding of Isaac, although it's not very systemic about it, or like Spelunky, or the game that you voice acted in, right? Right. So like, say in the tutorial you fight a skeleton, right? And then you kill the skeleton, and maybe there's 2 or 3 skeletons, you know, little battle, right? And then later on, you know, there's a skeleton who like holds a bomb, and after you kill him, it blows up like 2 turns later or something, right? So that is a modifier on something that you already know how it works. And then maybe you can learn, maybe the bomb's a surprise the first time. I mean, if you see a bomb, you should probably worry about that. But you know, it drops on the ground and then it blows up 2 turns later, and you're like, oh crap. And you're able to connect because you already knew the skeleton part. You already knew, okay, there's a skeleton. I know about how tough they are. I know how to attack them. I know what happens when I successfully attack them and take away all their HP. Oh, now this extra thing happened, right? Yes. And now maybe bomb is a modifier that could go on different enemies and stuff, right? And so that's an elaboration that can go onto the system. Yes. And I mean, there's a picture. Okay, here's what I think of as being the ideal that I haven't ever quite reached. Oh, yikes. Okay. Yeah, but that I think can happen in this kind of game, right? And I'm just going to put it out there because it's also, this is not very directly actionable, but I want to see what you think about this idea. Because you actually know way more about music than I do. Okay. Is a music analogy, right? Okay. And almost nobody else in the world will understand this music analogy because popular music doesn't work this way mostly, especially not like kind of music, right? Okay. But in like actual music and actual composition, right? Mm-hmm. There's this idea of like a musical argument, right? There's, you know, a theme that you make, and then it gets elaborated, it gets restated, and it's not I see what you're saying, yeah. Like in actual sophisticated music, or not even sophisticated, but like music in the old days, right? Yes. There was some idea content that was put forth in the beginning, and you know, like Bach or Beethoven do this all the time, right? There's some idea content that's put forth in the beginning, and it gets played with in patterns, right? Right. To make bigger patterns, yes. Right, and to make shapes. Yep. And you might have a first movement where it's like, let's do this idea this way for a while. And then the second movement starts and it's a different idea, but then maybe later the first idea comes back, right? Like, yes. I feel like in principle, games actually should maybe even be better than music at that thing, right? I think they're worse than music at, like, for example, being directly emotional or something, right? There's something about music that really like grabs people's emotional sense, but yes, but in terms of primordially, yes, yeah, but in terms of making that kind of like beautiful, elaborate pattern, I think games can make much bigger, much more elaborate, much more beautiful patterns. And I don't think it takes a puzzle game to do that. So like, you know, one thing that I have done in lectures lately is I've taken a game that's messed up in a lot of ways, like Pubg, right? And pointed out, by the time you're good at Pubg, like if you've got a few chicken dinners at some point, there's a whole bunch of stuff you understand. There's like a whole big system. It's not, in many aspects, it's not a particularly beautiful system, but it's a whole big system that's very intricate. And for me to write down everything I know about Pubg would take a really long time, you know?
Yes, and it actually, I mean, to your point, Pubg, for all of its implementational disasterness, the actual feeling of playing the game is not that different from a symphony. There are repetitive parts that are similar but not identical. There are different kinds of parts, like, you know, you can imagine the act of being in a house when people are approaching it versus running through the fields to get to the next place. Sometimes it's tense, sometimes it's slow. Like, it has all of that same kind of pacing, and from game to game, they are the same in some ways and different in others, right? So
Totally.
I can totally see that being a reasonable way to look at it.
Yeah, and that's not remotely a puzzle game, right? But that thing that you understand that you're talking about right now is the same kind of thing that I try to do in a puzzle game when I design a puzzle game, is to make that big understanding, right? And so for an action game like Pubg, if I were trying to make my own battle royale or something, I would look at a composition like Pubg, like what is that space all unfurled out in the timeless abstract mental space of what is in my mind after I've played a ton of the game, right?
Okay.
And I would say that's not a very beautiful composition, that one that I know, but how can I improve it, right?
Right.
How can I make it better? And you know, for a game like that, and at one level, that statement is not that different from what I might have said when I was a lot less experienced at game design. Like, oh, I've played a bunch of RPGs. You know, I played the Ultima games. I played, you know, Baldur's Gate or something. What do I not like about Baldur's Gate? And what would I change to make it more fun or whatever, right? Is how I might have thought about it in the beginning. But make it more fun is, it's not a super powerful perspective to have, because it's kind of a one dimension. It doesn't suggest very much, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think saying that you're going to make something more fun, it just assumes it assumes the solution before you've even identified the problem. It's just like, sure, I mean, yes, if you could magically just make it more fun, you would, but that doesn't really tell you about how you do it, right? It's not. Yeah.
Yes. And so if you start looking at details, you start to get ideas. And so, you know, if you look at the composition made by Pubg, right? One thing that's very obvious is, well, it's a big bummer when, you know, 4 people get in and want a squad and one of them dies early and the game takes 45 minutes and whatever, right? And so one way to address that is very directly, right? And so games have done that. So like Apex Legends or whatever, you can res every battle royale now, just about, you can res your guys, right?
Yep. Yes, right. That's just like a patch. Like, we basically patched over this problem.
Yeah, and it does make it a little bit of a better composition probably in some ways, but you know, it also has downsides and everything. But that's also, it's like a very zeroth order approach. It's like, I got my hammer out and I'm just going to bang on this thing till it points a different direction, as opposed to like redesigning the bigger thing very much, right? And so I think the challenge...
The original analogy, it'd be like, people didn't like the tuba part, so we just got rid of the tuba part.
Yeah. Or what's the big ass thing? I forget what it's called.
The big ass thing? What is the big ass thing?
Timpani. Okay,
the drum?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, tuba is probably better though. So, I mean, that's my ideal. And I mean, I don't spend, because I'm making a programming language and stuff, I don't honestly spend enough time on game design right now to get better at that. So I want to get back to a point, you know, after we ship Braid Anniversary Edition, when, I mean, you know, maybe when the language is in open oh God, it's hard for me to imagine being less busy when the language is in open beta, but at some point I'll be doing more game design again. And that's the kind of thing that I'll be thinking about and working on. It's not easy, right? And so like one of the observations that I have is like, it's a lot easier now for me to have good ideas than it used to be for me, specifically to have good ideas. And part of that is just like experience at trying to have ideas, right?
Yes.
I don't know how much of a shortcut there is on that besides putting in the time. There probably is some because, like the examples of games that we all have to look at today, they just are better designed across the board than games 20 years ago. That's just true. And so, there's definitely like we're in an environment now where it's easier to have certain kinds of ideas than it would have been 20 years ago. But then, beyond that, like, I don't know, like what, it's hard to say much. Like, I always feel like it's hard to solve problems without specifics, I guess. Right. And so like for you, do you have like, there's several different spaces you could be in, right? One is like, well, I want this to be an interesting, challenging RPG, but I don't know how to fill in those blanks, right? Another one could be, I know what I want it to like feel like to play like at a sensory or emotional level, but I don't know how to make the game design rules that produce that. Another one might be like, I have some parameters, like, I don't like it when combats are really long, or I don't like it when you have like a million combats, right? And so where are you at on that? On any of those?
Well, so it's really less about that because I don't have any really pressing need to be good at this particular thing at the moment anyway. But slight spoiler warning, as you saw from when we did the code review the other day, like I had there's a whole thing in there where you can basically play that whole game, but it's not a real game. It's just I wanted to make sure that it could be actually played to vet the fact that everything that needed to happen for that type of game was in there, right?
Totally.
And as I was polishing up a bunch of the code this week, I was just thinking to myself, I was like, basically my skills with making the internals of an engine like this are so far beyond my ability to reason about what you would want such an engine to do. It's kind of a little bad, like it's embarrassingly bad. Like at this point, I probably should know a lot more about how those things work. And while I was thinking it through, it occurred to me that I was like, I just don't even really know how to frame that problem. Like if I was going to do an exercise every week on Saturday where I like sat down and tried like working on rules inside that engine to make something that was more fun, I other than just randomly doing stuff, I'm not sure that I really would have necessarily known. This conversation has already been beneficial because I can already think of a bunch of things that I hadn't thought of before, just having talked it out and listened to what you had to say. But it was mostly just from that. So it's a lot less about like, oh, I need to accomplish this specific goal. And more I was just like, it would help philosophically to have a better underpinning if you wanted to get better at this sort of stuff and just know what the fuck you were doing.
Yeah.
So it's more like that. And so in the specific case, it was mostly just about like, all right, so you've got this entire system and this whole thing runs and you can do stuff and explore and fight monsters and whatever, but okay, so what do you start doing? Like what do you concretely start to do? And so what you were sort of saying, if I took the point correctly from all the stuff that you just said, it sounds like basically what you do is you go, all right, I want to start out by saying, let me find a few things that I can communicate concretely to the player that are incredibly simpler. Like you gave the example of the skeleton.
Yeah.
Can I communicate a few basic types of things to the player that they will then understand? Like, here is a weak, fast enemy, and here is a slow, difficult to wound enemy or something. Like, just can I communicate something so that the player can now start to think that there are things in the world that have a meaning of some kind, right?
Yes.
And then step 2 is, if I can communicate something about the world to the player, can I then try handcrafting, like not even with like random generation or any of that stuff, like put all that aside and just be like, can I handcraft a scenario where the player can do something in one case, like beat the skeleton, and then not do it in the other case until they figure some new thing out, or do something. Like, can I create something that the player had to think to do at all? And then I guess from there, you continue to try and push that forward to like relaxing how specific it is, and just continuing to try and push forward as you experience it and say, how can I provide more opportunities for the player to do something? How can I provide more challenges along those lines, or so on and so forth?
Yes.
And,
Yeah, totally. So that I would say there's at least 2 dimensions of places to play in. So that's one of them, right? But imagine you couldn't think of anything right now that you might want the player to figure out, right? And let's imagine you don't have any new ideas at all, right? You're just like, I have this set of things, but you can start with some highly differentiated things, like you just mentioned. I thought that was a really good example, like light, weak enemy, right? Big, heavy enemy, and maybe a third one, right? Like maybe those 2 are melee, and then you have like mortar enemy or something, right?
Yes.
Or like, ranged something, right?
Yes.
And then, so this ties into the metaphor that I was doing earlier, but like you could just treat those as elements of a composition, right?
Yes.
And just see what you can compose with that.
Yes.
Like,
right.
Look,
yes.
Here's a room where the mortar enemy is way back and you've got to get way over to him, but there's a bunch of the beefy dudes and you can't really get past them. It's very hard, right? Or something. It's not obvious how to, you can just start playing with that. Or here's a level with a bunch of light dudes and one beefy dude. The beefy dude has the key to the door. Like, I don't know, right? But there's like, as soon as you have 2 things, you have the ability to make combinations and variations of those 2 things, right?
Yes.
And 3 things is even more, and whatever. And so what I find is, I can just start having ideas with that before I even know other things, right? And there's something very good about that. So like back in the 90s, we were also talking about like high level ideas, right? So back when I was working on the hover tank game, for example.
Oh yeah.
One of my very early, I had a couple things that I was excited about, and at least one of them was technical in nature, which was I wanted to have a far view distance, which what was considered a far view distance in those days is not all that far. But I wanted that, which actually it turns out that honestly didn't matter that much for the game design we were doing, right? If I'm being honest to myself today, and we would have been better off fogging it like everyone else does. But number 2 is I really wanted, so it was a game where you build your little base, right, from all these elements. You get like a repair station and a refueling station and all this stuff. And I was very adamant in my design sense that I wanted to stick to this high level principle, top level idea that you could put those base elements anywhere. The game didn't constrain you at all because you could have maximum creativity. The only limit is your imagination about where you want to put these things. And that, in retrospect, that was a very bad design decision. It led to a lot of just soupy, weird, like bad feeling gameplay in a lot of different dimensions. And so if I were to go back today, the first thing I would teach my younger self is, don't do that. Like, cause you have to look at the consequences of the idea and be reality based about what is actually happening because of it. And that's something that humans are notoriously fallible at, right? Like seeing the consequences of the idea, you have to really train yourself, because human beings very much have selective blindness about that kind of thing.
Oh
yeah. So one thing that's good about starting with these smaller elements and just playing with them, is you kind of don't have that particular problem, because you're just like, oh, what can I do with a light enemy and if my concepts are light enemy, heavy enemy, ranged enemy, what can I do with that, right?
Right.
And that's kind of bottom up design, right? And I do think the thing that works best is some combination or alternation between top down design and bottom up design. But I think not doing any bottom up design is kind of a classical way that game designs go bad, because that's what keeps it real, right?
Yes. Right.
Or like another way things can go wrong is I have my top down principles of what game that I want to design, but they actually don't have that much to do with the concrete elements that I'm playing with. Like the ideas that I'm trying to do are not in the gamut of the physical elements that I have, right?
Right, yes.
That's something that probably used to happen. That probably happened on the Hover Tank game too. And so again, keeping it real by playing with the low level elements is good.
Well, I think that's a crucial part of it too, what you just said about it needs to be a combination of the two things, because I feel like I took the point that you and I think it was Daniel Ben-Mergui had both said, and also actually Matthew Van de Vender did a whole talk on it that time from his car or something. About the design forward versus design backward thing.
Yeah.
Where hey, you need to experience the game and then decide what it needs and feel that out intuitively in a lot of places. And I took that point and I thought that was really smart. Absolutely. And I think all y'all are right about it. But the problem, because it feels a lot like programming to me, where it's you should be writing the code that does the loop thing first and figure out how that works before you start talking about what the architecture is, right? Or whatever.
Yeah.
It comports with my experience in another discipline, so it seems right. But the problem that I was having sort of getting to that point was just that statement, you should try to design forward in that way. It presupposes that you have something to design forward, right? And so you need some guidance, I feel like, for the absolute beginner on how do you set up the circumstances for you to start. And so the alternation where you just say, okay, let me pick a few simple top level things just out of thin air, and then I can play with those, see what happens, and then go back and refine seems reasonable to me, right?
One thing, okay, so the game that you're talking about, the map is randomly generated, right? For example.
Yes.
This is just a thought that just came up.
Okay, yeah.
So one problem that I think that most, these kind of, roguelite games or whatever.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of them lately. It's a genre that got popular. Maybe it's a little less popular now than it was a couple of years ago.
Well, been a lot of them. There were a lot of them at the time.
Yeah.
There's always been a lot of them.
Yeah. A few years ago, I think a roguelite deck builder was most trendy thing. Anyway,
yes.
And so one thing that I think most of those games don't do a good job at all is, they have random map generation, but it kind of doesn't matter in a certain way, right?
Yes.
The map it gives you a little bit of variety, but the map doesn't actually matter very much. And so that's a weird thing. That's actually where I personally would start is first of all, how do I make it matter, right? And then a related question is, what is it about the system of maps that this thing generates that could be interesting, right? Can it have an opinion about what to generate that's interesting? Can it have certain patterns that it prefers in a way that generates interesting gameplay in some way? And that probably depends on what the enemies are and all that, right?
Yes.
But I find that to be an often ignored dimension or something that people don't know that much what to do with. And it's actually kind of hard. So like on the game that you did voice acting in, that was a to be solved problem for me, right? Like that one had random map generation. It kind of mattered, but it didn't matter as much as I really would have liked it to.
Yes, I see.
Yeah. So, but like it's a weird thing because by randomly generating maps, right? Like if you claim that a game has ideas in it, right? Then by the simple act of randomly generating maps, a game is kind of saying that there's ideas there, right? Or else there aren't. Yes. And usually there aren't, right? But you know, like a good level designer, like if you've got a game full of handmade maps, there are probably ideas in those maps about how it's supposed to play, right? Every good game pretty much has that. Even if they're simple ideas, like, you know, there's areas around the edge with a lot of cover to hide behind, and in the middle there isn't, right? Or whatever. Yeah. And so that's something that random generation usually throws away. And it's like, well, how do you unthrow that away, right? How can the random generation, you know, matter a lot? And it might be as simple, you know, I don't know, maybe there's enemies that crawl along walls only, right? And have a 3 square range, I don't know, very heavy attack. And so you actually care about the shape of the walls at all times because maybe one of these guys is about to crawl along it. I don't know, stupid example, right? But
well, I mean, to be completely honest with you, like I might argue that in general, games even without random map design don't often do that good of a job with the map being relevant. Now,
that's true.
To a certain extent. So I'll this is getting totally off topic, but since you brought it up.
Yeah.
So authored games, so non-random map generation games.
Yeah.
They usually, the rooms themselves are constructed reasonably. So like some designer like put the cover in some reasonable positions for like the Gears of War guy to hide behind or something, right?
Yep.
But the actual connectivity, the part that a roguelike, when you're talking about random map generation, the part that they're actually talking about, which is that we like picked how many rooms there were and how they were connected, right?
Yeah.
That matters in almost no games. In my experience, anyway.
Well, I mean, there are definitely games that think about it a lot more, right? So like
a good example of one that does, do you think?
Like a Deus Ex style game. They try very hard. In fact, they try too hard because they're like, well, the modern incarnation of that kind of game tries too hard because they're like, oh my God, we promised players that we would let them play any possible way. So like they're like Ubisoft Deus Ex games are like every room has like a vent that you can go into or a door you can hack because you have to be able to play by stealth, right?
Right.
Or whatever. It's like very boring and very uninspired, but it at least shows you that they thought really hard about those things, right?
Yes. Okay.
But it definitely had that phenomenon, right? So another one, I mean, first-person shooters, they think really hard about maps all the time. Some are better than others about actually doing that well. But like even, you know, Call of Duty games, for example, even like do a pretty good job on the map these days. Okay. Usually, you know, like
for the single player.
Yeah, or the multiplayer, both. The ideas aren't particularly deep, right? But they do, like they are designed intentionally such that the layout matters usually. And that's just because they have, like, if you're making a Call of Duty game, you have a lot of history to build upon. Like tons of things have been tried and you just kind of know, unless you're the summer intern, you just kind of know what was done on the last couple games and like, hey, let's do like that, but different or whatever. Right.
I see.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say RPGs rooms kind of don't matter that much historically.
Yeah, they don't seem to.
There have been exceptions. So like I remember, and again, this might be just me remembering the highlights, but like
Well,
the
this is
the
something.
the end game of Ultima 4, for example, like when you're going through the final dungeon, like I don't know, there's just like rooms with rivers going down the middle and like secret doors that you have to have ranged weapons to open and like whatever, like while you're in combat. It's like not actually the good version of that, but it was like 1984. So what do you want?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
But I mean, I get it. In other words, like I was just looking for the perspective on it. I think I definitely get it now. Like I see what the process is, right? Like, I mean, doing it's another story, but like I feel like my head's in a better space about like how would you actually sit down to practice this sort of thing. But that makes perfect sense. And I think one of the other things too is that one of the problems with coming from it from an engine programming side of things is that the engine programming mindset for me, because it's almost exclusively what I ever do,
Yeah.
engine programming is about like enabling possibilities. So like typically where my brain is at when I'm working on a game is I'm thinking about how do I make this piece of code provide the most number or the highest quality of something to the people using it, right? And what I was sort of thinking about when you were talking about a lot of the things answering the original question is just that that's actually really bad. Like that's a really bad mental model. It's great when you're programming in an engine because you're trying to, because that's your goal when you're the engine programmer. But if you're thinking about the design, thinking about having the maximum number of possibilities is the wrong way around, because you need to arrive at those possibilities by starting with like a small set of well-defined things that you can get a handle on and understand, and then you could probably broaden them out. You can't go into it thinking, well, the design of this game is that the player can do everything all the time, and there's like every possible kind of monster, and you know, it's just like it's too broad at some level, and you don't really probably want to approach the problem that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I will say there is a little bit, so historically, there is a little bit of a leftover tendency for game designers to think that way, just because we grew up in such a constrained environment, right? Like
Right.
games in the 80s, you could barely do anything, right?
Yeah.
And so like speaking of Ultima games, I remember Richard Garriott saying this at some point that like, the new Ultima game's awesome because like you could pick up the fork off the table that you ate dinner with and then use that as a weapon to fight monsters, and like it's a real world and you can do anything, right?
Yeah.
And then again, talking about GDC, which is mostly useless, but I remember the good parts. You know, Frank Lance had a 5-minute rant at some point. It might even be on YouTube. You might be able to find it, but he called it the immersive fallacy, which is just, you know, that isn't and shouldn't be the purpose of games, is to like do anything because,
Right.
well, you know, not only because it doesn't mean anything, but like things that are useful and interesting because of what they don't do, right? And so, you know, his funniest example was, you know, if you're cavemen hanging out and you're talking about a bear, right? You use the word bear to refer to the bear. The word bear wouldn't be better if it had big teeth and could kill you, right? Like that would not be the word bear that you want to use, unless you're, I guess, a weird fantasy novel would have that, some kind of true names situation. But I think a lot of people at the time even didn't still understand what he was saying. But that's a very concise statement of the thing with me. Like if your game is going to be interesting, It's interesting to the degree to which it is different from the actual universe, right?
Yes.
Because if it's exactly the same as the actual universe, that's the universe, and we already have that.
Right. It's not beneficial.
Yeah. So I do think that most of the better game designers don't think that way these days, but I do think there's a residual tendency to think that way because that's just our history, right?
Yeah.
Because things were so limited before. I don't know. Yeah. What more can we say that's actually actionable to you, or do you feel like you have ideas of what to do now, or
no?
what?
I feel like that's enough. Like I feel like just like because really, and maybe I'll have more questions some other time, and I'll come back on the stream and annoy you. But it was really just trying to get like sort of just a philosophical perspective on that initial process because I just found it very daunting. Especially, I mean, doubly so when you are an engine programmer, because that means you can just go in and make anything you want. So you literally have really no constraints on what you're doing, and that's not a particularly good environment for learning. So if you're trying to learn something, you would really prefer to have some idea of like how to set up small learning scenarios. And so just even the most actionable thing is like literally just to like, okay, create 3 monster types, try to come up with interesting encounters with those monster types. Just do that. Like, just go do that. And don't think about anything else till you do that, right?
Totally. And that gives you a big picture of what you're dealing with. But also, right. in addition to, like, thinking about what's the player learning, like, do you find yourself having fun with it when you set up that scenario, right? Because if you're having fun with it, then that's a glimmer of what the player will have. That means that there's really something there, right? If you're not really having fun with it and you're just like, you know, iteration 17 is guy with slightly longer club in corner, right? Yes. That's probably going to be dead, right? Again, similar to music, right? I mean, I imagine, I've never been a composer, but I imagine that if you enjoy the aesthetics of the composition that you're making, that is not the same thing as somebody enjoying it by listening to it, but it's related. It tells you that something's there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I would look for that. Like look for, if you really enjoyed doing something, why did you enjoy that thing, right? Like why did you think that idea was cool? Right. And maybe see if you can go more in that direction. Yep. All right. People are saying your volume was way too low.
Well, I mean, I can understand why that would be a problem for them, but it certainly wasn't a problem for me. So
yeah, maybe I'll run this through like a equalizer before I ship it.
Okay.
If I ship it, I don't know. Since we've got chat open, are there any questions from the peanut gallery that either I or Casey could answer? We'll give people a few minutes. Someone says the volume isn't that bad, but I turned the decibels up now, so maybe there'll be too many decibels. Someone says, how to connect that symphony of mechanics, repetition, variation, overarching pattern, to other aspects of the game, e.g. story? I mean, that's a very presumptuous question. If you have, like, I'm not big on story in games, first of all. Just full stop. But most people are more big on story in games than me. That's not even true. It's not true that I'm not big on story in games. I'm not big on the way that it's usually done. Of course, Casey is famously working on a story game or some, generated story kind of game. So maybe he will have something to say to this, but if you've started out, if your presumption is I've got some mechanics and then I've got a story and I've got to connect these two things somehow, that's just going to be bad. Like, they have to be designed with respect to each other to begin with. And then it should actually be kind of clear how to connect them. If your story isn't connected to the mechanics at all, and you have to figure out how to bolt it on, then why is it there to begin with? I don't know. What do you think about this, Casey? I mean, in your case, story mechanics are, well,
I agree with literally everything you just said, pretty much, in the sense that actually that is one of the reasons why I wanted to work on something that was story tech related, is because I don't really feel like, I don't feel like much of a game designer, and I don't really know that you want to do much with stories and games in that sort of ugly kind of smushed together way. So I think of it as different. Like, I think of it more as this is a way that you experience a story where you participate in it, but I don't think of it as a game in the sense that I wouldn't, it's just not the same kind of a thing, right? Like, a game to me has rules or has like objectives, or I don't know, it's not quite the same thing in a way. So I do think that when you try to mix those together, which is not, I mean, it's not to say that you can't create objectives in a story thing, like, hey, try to get this character to do this thing by how you decide to play it or something. But to the extent that people do anything like that currently, it's almost always about taking some external gameplay that has nothing to do with the story and just reflecting that back into the story in like the most, ham-fisted way possible. Like, oh, did you shoot person X? Then therefore this part of the story happens, right?
Yeah.
And so I basically completely agree, and I am not working on anything that would actually have any bearing on that.
Yeah, and then also I think, so it's a very hard problem, as you know, how to do story well in games, right? But we also have this additional problem that on a societal level, we are uniquely unprepared to address this problem, because with respect to storytelling, I feel like we're one of the most infantilized generations of society in a very long time. Like, even children's story like Grimm's fairy tales and whatever, right? Were like very different back in the day from the versions that get passed around now, right? Like they had just kids getting killed and stuff. They were like dark. Yes. And they had undertones to them. About like, wait, what was this character really doing and stuff? And I don't know, even that, right? But then when people go and they say, oh, I want my game to have a good story, they think a good story is like Avengers Infinity War, right? Yeah. Or whatever. And it's like, all right, if that's your idea of a good story, have at it, but that's just not the team I'm playing on, right? It's just, so I don't know. All right. I'm going to skip questions that don't seem that relevant, or that I don't have anything new to say about, or that I feel we already talked about. Is demonstrating emergent behavior the true purpose of games? I mean, I don't think so. It probably depends on what you mean by emergent behavior. The Witness, for example, doesn't have a lot in the sense of behavior of a dynamic system evolving over time, but it does have this kind of, interplay of themes that are precomposed. It has some kind of precomposed, elaborated and refined and restated behavior, right? But I wouldn't say that. I would say, and true purpose of games, I don't even know what that means. But actually, Casey does more like, the story game is an emergent behavior game fundamentally, right? Or maybe it's changed. I don't know, but that was.
What does emergent behavior mean in this context? One of the problems, I don't really think I know what someone means when they say that, because are they talking about something the designer did not intend to happen? Or
Not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
I think the usual definition. I of course can't speak for the questioner, but the typical game designer, typical game designer definition of that would be like just chains of consequences that could be surprising to the player, but may or may not, because the designer has a great deal more experience with the game, probably are not surprising most of the time to the designer, although they may also be, right?
Okay. Okay.
So like emergent behavior in, I don't know, like maybe there's barrels with lava in them and barrels chain react with each other, right? And they make noise and noises distract monsters. And I was able to chain react some barrels to distract a monster to a different area from where I was. I don't know, like
Yeah.
multiple, that's a very weak example, but
Yeah.
Again, so Looking Glass used to try to design for emergent behavior all the time, right? Like, by the way, everyone who thinks entity component systems is a new thing, Looking Glass was all component systems all the time.
In
like,
1999.
well, before that, right? Like they went out of business in 99 or something. Or maybe I have that wrong. Maybe it was 2000.
I thought 99 was when they at least published it. They were probably slightly before.
I mean, they were doing that stuff. Like Thief 1 was like, burnable was like a property, right? That could be attached to things.
So it would have been 97. Because Thief 1 was the first game that shipped with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, they were trying to design for that. They were trying to, and back in those days, it was a little bit different too. It was like, how do we make interesting things happen without if statements, right? So that a richer variety of things than we explicitly typed in can happen, right? That's still a little bit different because as a designer, so one level of thing is what do I explicitly type in to happen, right? And then a next level of thing, what do I understand will probably happen as the consequence of the things that are typed in. And that's a bigger set of things probably if the rules are interesting. And then there's another sphere outside that, which is like, what are the things that may surprise me even after ship? And I think those two outer spheres are both emergent behavior, but I think it's also designers usually want to understand their game.
So I guess what I would say is that I guess I really don't. It's very hard to say. If I had to just specify it forward, I would say that I think of emergent gameplay in the story space as like I'm experiencing AI dungeon, right? Which I think is like it's sort of obviously not a high quality story if it can really be all that emergent, because stories don't tend to feel that kind of random in even like artsy experiential stories. Usually the good ones feel very intentional in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess what I would say is, at least for me, I would draw a pretty hard distinction between emergent in the simulational sense and intentional. And if emergent gameplay is the kind that's sort of simulational in that way, then it's expressly not what I would want in stories, and also what I think a lot of story tech gets wrong, which is to just like the sort of Chris Crawford style of things. Because I really don't think that adds much. Maybe that's interesting in the sandbox gameplay kind of world, where it's just like, I was doing this thing in Minecraft and something happened. But I don't think that's very interesting for narratives. So, no. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that goes back to the early history of stories even, right, is that the person who wrote the story and or is telling it to you verbally, because these predate writing, had a reason to tell it to you, right? Like, there's a reason why we're telling this story and not some other story. And just from a very basic standpoint, the story has to satisfy that reason for its being told. And that implies some constraints on what happens or how it happens.
Yes.
So like if anything can happen, there's not really a reason for the story.
I might almost make the argument that they're mutually exclusive. So a high quality narrative and at least the sense, like my feeling about what people mean when they typically employ the word emergent gameplay are actually sort of antipodal. And it might not be in certain cases. So if the Looking Glass designer, for example, when they talk about emergent gameplay, is talking about telling a story about how the thief got into this building and it happens to involve like choosing to shoot this water arrow at this thing.
Yeah.
That I think is fine, but to me that wasn't, I don't know, or I don't think they should have classified that as emergent gameplay. That is the intentional gameplay. That's the intentionality prong, like you were talking about originally.
Yes.
That Doug talked about a lot, and I feel like intentionality and narrative go together quite well. Emergence and narrative, I don't really think do, unless you think that improv is like the one true way to tell stories. And at least personally, I think improv is probably like one of the least interesting ways. Not that it's not fine, but it's just not what I would aspire to create, right? Like I'm not like trying to figure out how to make the best improv story, right? Like that, you know.
No, yeah. I mean, even if you subtracting the interactivity part for a minute and just talking about improv versus not, like I don't go to see movies that are filmed improv.
Yeah.
Like that's just not, you know. In fact, that's why some of these comedies are so bad nowadays.
Well, or if you've ever watched like a Dogma 98, whatever, there was like a entire film movement that was based on, you know, just basically filming improv and not really editing it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is a way to occasionally produce an interesting movie. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that you should do it, but by and large, most of what you get is not very compelling, right? Not compared to a good screenwriter.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the motivation for that too, because there's a certain way in which, for example, Hollywood stuff is just very shallow and doing things for merely presentational purposes and manipulative and whatever. And that's a way of getting around that. But like, seems like an overreaction to me. I'm not a filmmaker, but like, you know, it is what it is. Okay. Hey, here's a question. You may not have anything to say about this. I think I have a little bit. In multiplayer, how can design reduce metagaming, power creep, min-maxing like behaviors? And I mean, I don't know why nobody ever did this. So the current thing that's in vogue right now is because you need new stuff to sell to people all the time anyway. All these games have seasons where they like change stuff up every 3 months or whatever. And then you have to figure out the new min-max, which usually doesn't take very long if you're good at the game. But what I was going to do, even way back in the EverQuest days, when I was like, okay, if I make an MMO, it's going to be like the horoscope MMO or whatever, right? Where, okay, so most games, and this goes back to the history of single player games, right? Most games are statically balanced in that all the parameters have fixed values. Even if they're meta values, like, oh, you get more powerful as you have fewer hit points, right? That equation is still fixed. And so it's solvable. There is some solution to the optimum, right? And in multiplayer, in single player, it doesn't bother most of the players that much if one person finds the solution to the optimum, because it doesn't affect the other player's ability to play, except maybe that they're bummed that they don't get very close to the high score or whatever. But of course, in multiplayer, you just get owned by the guy who figured it out, right? So what I was thinking anyway that would be more interesting is just like, look, you know, you can draw a bunch of sine waves across like the astrological chart based on what stars are in the sky right now or whatever. And like, you know, like frost power is a little bit more powerful on Tuesday than Wednesday, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, the maximum is on Tuesday or something. And then, lightning is better at other times, and it's based on environment. Like you also add a lot of variables, like, hey, if the air is dry right now, lightning is better or something, right? And
actually, I feel like there was single player games that did this kind of thing, which was kind of not that interesting because you don't really want to have to play a single player game and think about if like the moon is a crescent moon right now.
Yes.
But it makes a ton of sense for these games that people play every day for hours a day, right?
Yes. I mean, multiplayer games, one of the biggest problems they have right now is they're trying to be like lifestyle games, right? Like I'm trying to be a thing that people play several days a week for years. And
right.
How do I give them that much playtime? Like how do I make myself interesting enough? And that's one way to do it, is having more and more nuance in the game. And I'm a little surprised. I haven't heard of any game doing that kind of thing, right? Maybe somebody has, or maybe somebody will. But that would be my solution, is you make it a very complex space, but you also make it dynamic so that the optimum varies based on both a series over time, but also based on context of what's around you, but not randomly, right? Because you still want it to be a skill to know what to do.
I think that sounds really intriguing, just in terms of a nice feel for playing a multiplayer game too, because it's pretty interesting to imagine the game where I was like, I definitely want to play Friday night because it's it's high tide is going to be around 5 p.m., which is the closest to nighttime it will be in a while. So I'll finally be able to like probably get through that cave, which happens to be at the edge of the water. And I'm someone who like casts better stuff in water and at night or whatever,
Yeah.
That would be kind of something you never experience anything like that with current games. It's just like, I don't know, I'll just play it and it's the same as it was yesterday. So it would be kind of cool.
We'll see. I mean, there might be some problem with that idea that I never saw, but who knows? Someone's asking, do you have any examples of a game from semi-recently, 10 to 15 years, that tells its story in a good way? Casey has probably paid much more attention to game stories than me. My go-tos for game stories are Trinity by Brian Moriarty, which was the game that sort of taught me that art games were a thing. So it's the entire reason why, it's not the entire reason, but it's a large part of the reason why I do art games today. It's more modern. I don't know. I mean, certainly most of the games that people say have amazing stories, I don't like. Although there's a few from lately that I haven't played. I don't know, Casey, since you've played a lot more in the way of story games, probably. What do you think?
I guess, I mean, I don't really think of story games in particular as, because people have no story technology, generally speaking.
Yeah.
If a game is a story game, it's almost certainly not good. But someone in the chat mentioned, for example, Obra Dinn. I do think that's a good example of a game that had an interesting way of telling you a story. Right?
Yeah, okay.
It is not a story game, meaning there is no interaction with the story whatsoever.
Yeah.
But that was pretty interesting. I would be hard pressed to come up with many examples though, because in the past 10 years, I don't know that I can think of anything where people were doing particularly much. A lot of people, and I'm sorry to say I still have not played it, a lot of people said there were interesting things with Disco Elysium. I played only the demo version originally before the game was out.
Yeah.
And there wasn't anything particularly interesting in that, but I gather that the actual like full game is actually somewhat different. So
maybe I should play that
one, but
I have not, only because I don't know. People were saying it's really good, which first of all, I never trust that. and then secondly, there was something about why people said it was good that I was like, no, I'm not going anywhere near that. But I don't remember what that is, and so I'll probably try it.
At the very least, I did like the fact that it was. So I didn't see anything interesting there in terms of like story really all that much, but it was at least a game that had more to it in terms of like a narrative. Like it was actually a world I was interested in finding out a little bit more. There's more creativity to it, I guess I would say. So at least in that sense, I wouldn't be averse to playing it. But I didn't really get the sense that there was going to be anything really that revelatory about the way they were telling it, though. So, but I just thought the writing was, in that demo anyway, it was like, oh, okay, like there's actually these. I kind of want to find out more about this world and these characters, which is more than I can say for like a lot of times when I, play a game.
Yeah. Okay, new question. What's your opinion on a generalization that novels move the experience forward by turning pages versus games move the experience forward by movement through space, movement through time, and transactions? And I mean, like that's kind of just the definition of the two media. And I feel like the job of games is to figure out what you can do with those latter things, right? I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like a very actionable question to me in some sense. Do you have anything to say about that one?
No. I mean,
right.
I guess I could just say the fact that I would probably dispute the statement that novels move things forward by turning pages, because that isn't really what happens. At least, I would not have categorized it that way. So typically the way I would think about how a novel moves things forward is actually much more similar to how a game moves things forward, with the sort of only real difference being that there's no choice involved. So much like a game designer can provide a number of different sort of ways in which they are communicating with the player, and some of those are subtle and some of those are blatant and some of those are immediate and some of those are latent. Novels are the same way. So it's not like 2 pages, like the way the question was asked makes it sound like 2 pages. Any 2 pages in a novel are basically the same amount of quote unquote moving forward or something.
Yeah.
But actually, like, there can be pages of a novel that move things forward not at all.
Yep.
And pages in a novel that dramatically change everything that came like before and after,
Yep.
And so I feel like I wouldn't really look at it that way, and that may not have been sort of the gist of the question anyway, but just struck me as a little odd. Because it's really more the sentences and what's kind of happening in terms of like what those sentences are forcing your mental model of this novel to do in your head. And that feels to me a lot more similar to sort of the way game designs work, where there's several different sorts of things that could be happening at any given time, and some of them have bigger effects than others.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add to that. I think that's definitely true. So back on the moving parameters thing, someone's saying, don't you think that the experience of mastering a fixed system is lost in that case, though? And no, because you design it to be masterable. That's why it's good, right? It's just not as simple because it's dynamic over time. And I mean, it just means it. So, okay. So here's a thing that's interesting about games, broadly speaking, right? That I think is not played with enough. So let's just go back to talking about single player games for a minute. It's like action games or something. You're fighting bosses. It's Binding of Isaac like game, maybe. And so one thing that's very boring is if there's one dominant strategy that you always just do that thing, right? So like there's a room that always has the same weapons in it. And if you pick weapon 7, you just know how to use that and win the game. Super boring because you always just walk into that room and get weapon 7 and then you play the game, right?
Yep.
It's a little more interesting if that room has 7 out of 50 randomly generated things and you need to pick 2. And then there might be 2 that gives you a degenerate strategy, like, brimstone plus something else, but you won't usually get those. And then you at least have to understand the space better because you have to know which 2 to pick in order to do things, right? Now, and so on, you can think about ways to make that more interesting. However, right, it's more interesting then if whichever things you pick are better or worse throughout the game situationally, right? Like it depends on what monsters are in this room. It depends on the shape of the room or what kind of material it's made out of or whatever, right? All these things. Like like situational is good because it means, first of all, that there probably isn't a totally degenerate strategy. But secondly, it means that you as a player are active in thinking about what to do. Whereas if you already knew what the best thing to do would be before walking in the room, you're just kind of being a vegetable while you play the game, right? As opposed to actively
and there's not
engaging.
much, and to the point from before, there's not much of a point to that room because it's the same as if you walked into a different room.
Yes. Now, one thing that's an extra bit of spice to think about as a designer is, so let's just think about, you know, you've got some space, some abstract space. People who don't think mathematically are not going to like this metaphor, but I don't have a better one. It's a metaphor I use all the time. You just got some space with some dimensions where each dimension corresponds to like one dimension of a strategy, right? So like I pick this weapon, that's one thing. I pick this armor, I go in this direction, right? And on every point of that space is just like the score of how good that strategy is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is that space very smooth, or does it have some high frequency ripples in it somewhere, but that still makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of interesting, right? If like, you know, oh, the best thing to do in this case is, you know, to deploy this unit to the west and then use this weapon or whatever. And if that tree up there were 3 inches to the right, it's still the best thing, but by a little bit less. But then if that tree is 1 more inch to the right, such that it blocks some line of sight or something, now sending that unit off to the left is going to be totally useless because I can't use the information that it's giving me. So I need to do something totally different, right?
Yes.
So like having discontinuities in that space makes the space much more interesting for a lot of reasons, in part because you can't, like, again, you can't be a veg and kind of like heuristic the space very easily and like, oh, I didn't get that close to the optimum, but it didn't matter because it's very smooth, right? But then another thing is you get to observe and be interested in the shape of the space when the space has a lot of interesting features like that. Like when you're learning the game, you learn to recognize this kind of situation where it's like, oh, it's almost like I could use that strategy here, but I can't, right? And that becomes a feature of the space. And so I forget how I was going to tie that back into the multiplayer thing. But it's just to say that it's about the multiplayer thing that I was talking about is about building a version of that space that where time is one of the parameters in some way, but that's understandable and masterable, and that creates interesting ripples in that score value of how good the strategies are at different times. So it would still be one that you could understand as a player and maybe is better to understand, more interesting.
It seems like it would also be the kind of thing that just has a nice aesthetic effect on the game as well, because if you imagined that various different types of player classes are going to be more or less dominant in different areas and or at different seasons or times, that adds a certain feel to the world. I mean, you imagine the case where you're like, oh, like the wolves are out, you know, the werewolves are out on the full moon, right?
Yeah.
That's an actual aesthetic element of a game. It's like that the player can actually feel and perceive in a way that has nothing to do with them wanting to win or lose even. It's just now the game feels and looks a certain way at certain times as well. And that seems pretty compelling as something that, you know, you don't experience now. Like if a game looks a certain way now, it's because, you know, Epic decided that they were going to have this event in the game. Like it's not because of some emergent thing that happened because of that of the actual gameplay rules having that ebb and flow. So that seems kind of interesting too.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, anything like, you know, when things affect multiple dimensions of the game, that's strong, right? It's like, hey, this is an aesthetic element, but also, you know, it changes the space of what's a good idea to do, and so
Yeah.
forth, right?
Everything works kind of in concert, so it all reinforces itself.
Yeah, that's very strong anytime that you can do that. And that's a thing that's kind of universal. Like there aren't that many universal rules of art, I don't think, but that's one of them, right?
Yeah.
Like in a story, if you can make a sentence do 3 things, that's better than doing one thing. In fact, if you read a story where every sentence is only doing one thing, it can easily get kind of just feel like you're plodding along, right?
Yeah.
And great writing, is about mood and character and plot all in the same sentence, right? Or whatever,
Well, and similarly, it's also about how the things reinforce each other, right? Like a movie which is talking about something, and the way that it talks about that thing is that, like, at the end of the movie, the narrator says that thing, and I'm thinking very specifically, actually, of recently there's a movie you probably didn't see. It was called Into the Spider-Verse or something.
I did not see that. Yeah.
So the entire movie, if you actually were to look at like what the details and the plot of the movie imply thematically, at the end of the movie, the narrator literally says, as the closing part of the movie, what the theme of the movie was supposed to be.
Okay.
But that theme is completely contradicted by all of the events in the movie.
Welcome to recent movies. I mean, first of all.
And so now, if this were an Orson Welles picture, I would assume it was intentional and possibly meant to be that way, right? Yeah. But it's not. And so it's the kind of thing where you just have to shake your head and go like, yeah, the point of constructing any body of work that goes together, I would have hoped, would have been that you thought about things like what was the meaning of this thing, or what you were communicating or trying to communicate, or even how you were communicating it. You're supposed to be having, like, every scene you thought about its relationship or something.
That used to be part of the job.
Yeah, and now it's not. And so I think, like, it's definitely the case that even before you start talking about does this sentence do multiple work, it's like, just how aligned are the things in general? And a lot of times in a lot of works, everything is just all over the place. The aesthetics are doing one thing and the dialogue's doing another, and the theme is something else entirely according to the narrator, and you're just like, what the fuck is going on?
So what you're saying is it's more of an Orson Welles wine commercial than an Orson Welles film.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Did Pitch Meeting guy... Did Ryan George do an Into the Spider-Verse pitch meeting? I don't remember.
He might
have.
I've
seen all of them, so I should know, but at some point they all blur together.
I can't remember if he did or didn't.
I think he did. I think it was recent.
I think he did.
I think it was like a month ago, honestly.
But he didn't pick up on that particular part because, like, one of the things about the pitch meetings things is they're rarely high concept-y. They're more just like, obviously, like, okay, so this scene the character says that they can't fly, and then the next scene they fly around, right, or whatever.
Yeah.
And he had plenty of those because it was that kind of movie too. It was like from scene to scene, you're just like, why did they? Wait a minute, like. If that person's only been there if that person's only been in this universe for 5 days, how did they get into the private school that you just said takes years to apply to? Or, they're just like, because they are, or whatever.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yep. I don't know. Are we done?
I think we're done. I mean, you answered all my questions a long time ago. So.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more sparking, insightful questions from the Peanut Gallery either. We'll give it one last chance for really amazing questions for Casey Muratori. Oh yeah, someone linked the pitch meeting.
Well, I will also say thanks very much, John, for entertaining my question.
Sure. I mean, if you want to talk about this again, like I like talking about game design. I have fun with it. I don't necessarily know how useful it will be, right? I mean, here's one thing, right? and I try to say this to other people as well. And I don't think you need me to say this, right? This isn't going to be a problem for you, but maybe for people in the audience who are also thinking about game design and stuff. And that is, we're still pretty early in game design, and we're figuring out games, and we're figuring out what they can do. And what I've kind of done is, I'm not done with this yet, but I've sort of carved out like my personal space of game design, of like, what's my design sense, right? And my personal style and whatnot. And if games are interesting, right, then that aesthetic that I've been largely talking about today is a relatively small subset of all the so first of all, hopefully it's not as strong of an aesthetic as things that we will eventually find, right? And then secondly, there should hopefully be many of those, right, in the end, right? If games are as big and interesting as we think maybe they are. And so, right, the problem is the advice that I gave you is kind of for my style, right? It's like if you're in China and you go to a martial arts studio, and like the guy teaches you monkey style or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then you go to like a Wing Chun guy later, and he's like, what is this crap that you're doing? It's not, so there's a little bit of that element. However, honestly, we haven't figured out that many styles at the level that I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
So it's just to say though that like, so if Casey goes off and works on his game, I'm not necessarily trying to encourage him to do things the way that I do, because we don't need people to do things the way that I do, because we have me already, right? I do things the way that I do. But what we want everybody to do is to find their style, right? Their expression in the medium. And that's why everybody is their own independent artist, and why they have something valuable to add, right? And so I know that Casey has a very strong sense of his own, what he likes and what he doesn't like, and what he thinks is good and what he doesn't think is good. So, he doesn't have that problem. But I definitely want to emphasize to other people, I'm not saying like there's a specific good way to find to design a game, right? Like if games are any good as a medium, we won't figure out the really good things for hundreds or thousands of years, because that's just how long it takes. And who knows, what human beings will even be at that point. So, it's at the same time, it's a starting point. So the reason I'm saying this stuff, and if we post it on YouTube later, the reason I say these things is it's my current best idea of how to design games right now. And then somebody else's job, like a young person who's just getting into game design, their job is to take those ideas and, accept some of them, reject other ones, go further in some directions, and push out the space of what we understand and what we can do well, right? And if we don't do that, we're in trouble, right? So if you go off and do exactly what I said, we're kind of in trouble, because that's not actually very good, right?
So I have one thing to add to this.
Yeah.
So the thing I would add to this is actually I would retroactively take back from what you just said, the thing about me. I actually don't feel like I have any of the things you just said.
Well, in game design right now, right? But personality-wise, you do, right?
Okay, maybe for other things, but yeah.
Yes.
So for game design, and what I was going to say about that is, I actually think that there's a lot of value in, like, using your analogy. There's a lot of value in people training up on styles separately anyway, in much the same way that I doubt it is useless for a kung fu master to go train with another kung fu master and learn the style that they have perfected, because it broadens your horizons, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so actually, and because I mean, John, I've seen a lot of kung fu films.
Yes.
I was actually personally insulted that you posted a poll the other day and did not include Iron Monkey, but okay.
Wait, I didn't? Wait, what were
I
my...
don't remember
I
it
said,
being on there.
I said Flying Guillotine, The Raid 2, uh, Black Dynamite, which was, by the way, the correct answer to the poll. Maybe
Okay.
I just didn't put 4 because I didn't... Yeah, Iron Monkey should have been on there. You are correct, sir.
Yes, I was like, what's going on? But
yeah.
what I was going to say is I've seen a lot of kung fu movies, and I know for a fact that sometimes when the corrupt royal minister comes to town, it takes 2 iron monkeys to fight off the royal minister, not just one. And so having like multiple people practicing a particular style is also good, right? So there are people who will certainly blaze their own, like devise their own new techniques or something, and that's awesome. But also just like having people who are good at like your technique would be great, because we don't, it's not like we have an embarrassment of people who can do that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, it helps you search the space faster, right? And get to
Yes.
other places. Yeah.
And well, and to keep it alive, like, you know, you get run over by a bus tomorrow, as awful as that would be if there were a bunch of disciples, think of how awful it is if no one knows how to do what you do. It's gone forever.
Yeah.
Like, right?
Yep.
So it's also, there's just a case of like keeping the lineages, and that's one of the things that disciples do as well, right? In that case, they're just like, oh yeah, you know, and it doesn't prevent them from exploring their own thing, but yeah. From my perspective, I usually just think of it as like, look, I'm the type of person who builds armor for these fighters or something, right? So I want to understand, in a lot of cases, I'd like to understand better how the fighting happens, because a lot of times I just feel like it's a part that I don't really get. And so more practice on my part in how you do those sorts of things is just beneficial.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it. Well, thanks, man. It's been fun, like I said. And
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer my question.
Yeah, I hope it goes well. And, you know, again, we could do this again sometime. Like, I feel like the tenor of the conversation would be very different if it's like, oh, I have these specifics and I'm not quite sure how to solve that, right?
I could try, like, if I get to a place where I'm like, oh, this seems like something that's like easy to discuss concretely, then I could send it to you and you can see.
Yeah, right on. All right.
Cool, man.
Cool, man. Good talking to you.
You too. Take it easy.